Thank you for joining the Walt Weekly. We can be found at Facebook, The Walt Weekly Podcast, Twitter, @Walt Weekly, Instagram, The Walt Weekly, and www.thewaltweekly.podbean.com. Please like, follow, and share. Black History Month celebration. The celebration of Black History Month began as a Negro History Week, which was created in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson. It became a month-long celebration in 1976. Black History Month is held in February to celebrate the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln.
Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our celebration of our Black History sports athletes. So many to start with. So many great names. So many great people who not only made their mark in life with sports, but did it under tremendous pressure and were really great human beings. So I want to start with Jack Johnson, who is the Galveston Giant. Because Jack Johnson represented so much more than a sports figure. He was an imposing man who dominated his sport at a time that was just really rough for African Americans. But he wasn't just an athlete. He was a businessman. He had endorsements. He had properties. He did so many things with the space and the time that he had on the earth, and he was unapologetic about it. That was my biggest takeaway with Jack Johnson. He was unapologetically Black, and he made his mark on the world, and he did it in the face of terror, and he didn't back down. So I want to start with his most significant fight, which was with James J. Jeffries. That was the fight where he won the title, and he knocked him out in the 15th round. But that wasn't just winning the title wasn't the only thing he came away with. When he won that title, when he knocked out Jeffries, race riots went on across the country because he dared to stand up, not take a dive, and take down this white man. So that bout was significant because it started a revolution, really. He was revolutionary. He took on white America. He took on the Klan. He had a penchant for white women. And that was one of the ways that they were able to take him down, because they created laws specifically to stop Jack Johnson from dating white women. And he wound up leaving the country for 7 years because they had a warrant. The FBI was going to lock him up. He wound up returning. He served his time. And ironically, he was pardoned by Donald Trump in 2018. If that wasn't, if that's not strange.
Wow.
But it says so much about who Jack Johnson was and what he accomplished. And to have Donald Trump pardon him, probably, some people didn't like it, but I think it's fitting, because he stood his ground to white America. So for me, he is one of my biggest heroes in the sports space.
That's incredible.
Yeah, Jack Johnson was amazing. Amazing. And to think he did all of that in a short period of time. He was forced to leave the country. They didn't know what to do with Jack Johnson. Many people made a lot of money off of him. So
Right.
he was more valuable alive. But he flaunted things in their face that they just couldn't take. They couldn't take. And he did it with pride.
Right.
So he is my first star that we want to shed some light on. And
Awesome.
following Jack Johnson was so many. Look at how we dominated the space of boxing. Through the ages, through the years. But he opened that door for so many, for Ali, for Mayweather, for all of these people, Tyson. I don't think there was anybody more imposing who did it in a more stressful time under such duress. He did it, and he did it with class. So he was my biggest sports hero. The second guy on my list is Jackie Robinson.
Yes.
And Jackie Robinson is an interesting person that we look at, because he wasn't just picked for his athletic ability. They picked Jackie Robinson because of his demeanor on top of his ability. They needed somebody that they felt wouldn't be broken in the face of what he was, what he was going to face when he got on the field. They needed somebody that could take that could kind of look the other way and understand the significance of what he was embarking on. April 15th, 1947, he was introduced to the major leagues, and boy, under so much duress, from his teammates. Can you imagine playing for a team and going out there giving your all, and you can't sleep with the team, you can't stay at the same hotels, you can't go to the same restaurants, you can't practice with them, and on the field with them, your own teammates calling you racial slurs, jealous of you, actually don't want you to succeed, rooting against their own success. And in the face of all that, he became the Rookie of the Year. And he managed to carry the Dodgers to 6 World Series. They won 1, but going up against their juggernaut, the Yankees, kind of tough to get more than 1. They were lucky to probably even get 1. But he did all of that in the face of so much. He won the MVP in 1949, 2 years later after he made his debut. But what I find was more challenging for him was having to deal with all of that on the other side and getting some pushback from his own people because they felt he didn't stand up. He kind of rolled over. Black people started turning against him. I believe Jackie was a Republican, if I'm not mistaken. So his politics came into play. And you're going out there on a daily basis trying to do something for your people, and you have your own people questioning you. So for him, it was extremely difficult. But he held it all together. He did it. He was dignified in doing it. And he holds a special place in my heart because I don't know if I could be that great a man. I would like to believe I could, and I would, but that's a difficult, that's a heavy load to carry. Right. Heavy load, So Jackie Robinson deserves so much more from us. I mean, he's getting everything, but he deserves more than that because he carried, he did it during the time of civil rights movement. He carried much more than baseball. and his people. You know, he carried his people on his shoulders. And to do that and to have people turn against you, I think that kind of broke his heart a little bit. Kind of broke his spirit for a while. But he still succeeded. He was great. He opened the door. He ushered the gates open for so many people. Right after he came in, there was Larry Dolby, who debuted for the Cleveland Indians in 1947, July. Hank Thompson, St. Louis Browns, July 1947. And Willard Brown, same year, 1947. But Jackie Robinson kicked open the gates for so many others who have succeeded in the sport, and he deserves a place in our Mount Rushmore of black athletes. My next star, I got quite a few, but my next star, a lot of people probably wouldn't know. And I picked him because of the sport that he embarked on. And that's Charlie Sifford.
You know I know him.
Yes, I know you know him.
I never heard of him.
Yes, Charlie Sifford was the first African American to break through in the PGA Tour. And if you know how much heat this man got for wanting to play in that sport, you know, we already know it was considered a sport for the wealthy, right? And it was considered a white man's sport. And he challenged them. He challenged himself to go into this sport. And he was great. You know, he had 422, he played in 422 tournaments. He had 50 top 10 finishes and 22 professional wins. And he did that in the face of Jim Crow.
That's right.
In a sport that we weren't supposed to play. So Charlie Sifford is somebody that to me is amazing. Like, all of these people are amazing because of the time that they did this. But him picking that sport, you know, that wasn't considered. And, you know, we were just the caddies, right? We couldn't stay on the resorts. We could only work on the courses, but we couldn't play them, you know? Right. Or if they played them, they had to play them at night in the dark where, you know, it was difficult to see, poor equipment. And he did it and he broke through. So he is somebody that is to be commended, held up. He's somebody that we should know more about. His name should come about. You know, when you speak of Tiger Woods, you should speak of Charlie Sifford because he opened the door for Tiger Woods. You know, death threats, constantly lived under the pressure. And this is the time where, you know, this is 1950s, you know, these are tough times. Jim Crow is all over, wearing us out. And these people have, you know, they accomplished great things. So Charlie Sifford is on the Mount Rushmore of black athletes. I want to touch a little bit on my next GOAT. I call him the GOAT because he has 11 titles in his respective sport, and that's Bill Russell. Bill Russell won 11 titles in 13 seasons for the Boston Celtics. He was the first black coach in the NBA. 1966, he was a player coach. He led his team to Olympic gold in 1956. But more importantly, he held that summit with other black athletes to bring attention to the horrors of Jim Crow. And he stood tall in doing that when he was told he may never play again if he stood up. And they did that, and he did it anyway because he knew his worth. He knew how important he was to the sport, but he also knew how important he was to his people. And he stood his ground, and I commend him for it. And anybody that has 11 championships in 13 seasons, I don't know, I might consider him the GOAT over Tom Brady or a few other people that they want to throw that word around very loosely. You know, winning 11 championships in the Jim Crow era, that's quite a feat. You know, as great as LeBron James is, as great as Michael Jordan is, could they have done all of that in that time?
Right.
These guys weren't able to practice. They weren't able to travel with the teams, like I said. They didn't have the best equipment to work with. And yet they still came out on top with all that against them. So for me, that's why these athletes are the GOATs, because they did it in uncomfortable times. My next Mount Rushmore athlete is Arthur Ashe. He was the first Black tennis player to win 3 Grand Slams in another sport that we were not supposed to partake in, and that's tennis. In 1968, he won the US Open. In 1970, he won the Australian Open. In 1975, he won that sport's most prestigious award, the Wimbledon title. All in the face of horrific racism. Wonderful human being. Somebody that you can look up to, your kids can look up to. It's so, you know, he's such a lost hero. He's very rarely spoken about, but he towered over the game at a time when he wasn't supposed to. These are people that we need to shine a light on. So many of these athletes are forgotten. 43 years later, after Arthur Ashe was the first African American to win the US Open, Serena Williams was the next African American to win that title. 43 years separated them. That is amazing. She's amazing. But if not for Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson, another first African American to compete in pro tennis, which she did in 1956. She won the French Open. 1957, she won Wimbledon and the US Open. And in 1958, she won the same titles again. All in all, she won 11 Grand Slams. She has 6 single titles. So you talk about great athletes. And Althea Gibson had all kind of medical issues going on with her, on top of dealing with racism in such a tough time. So these athletes led the way. They kicked the door open for so many others to achieve greatness. Serena Williams stands on her shoulders. I saved my best sport, my favorite sport, for last. And I'm going to say it's my favorite sport because I love football. I grew up watching it. I think football is the toughest sport for African Americans because I still believe the National Football League still operates as a good old boy organization. Right. And I'm going to start with Fritz Potlet and Bobby Marshall. They were the 2 first African Americans to play in the NFL. Marshall played tight end. He ran track and field. He was a boxer. He played baseball. He played hockey. He did all of that between 1920 and 1925. Potlet was a running back and was actually the first Black head coach. Unfortunately, in 1927, the league that they played for was dissolved and Blacks were removed from the NFL in 1927. They didn't return until 1933. And But they left a mark, those two players. So football in 1933, the Cleveland Rams moved to LA. And it was only on one condition. This was the year that they let African Americans come back into the sport. That team had to integrate. So Kenny Washington was actually the first NFL player to sign a contract in the modern era. Those other two never played under contract. Kenny Washington was the first to sign the contract. And Charles Folis was actually the first African-American footballer to play the sport, which was in 1902 through 1906, but he never got credit for actually playing in the league. So that's why he doesn't go down as the first African-American to play in the sport. The NFL has a practice of overlooking its athletes, white or black, right? But it has a special way of treating African Americans in that sport. It's 84% African American. I believe that's the right number. I think it's 84 or 74%. And yet we represent the least amount in management, coaching positions, but yet we take the field, and mostly all the most important positions are held by us, by African Americans. I wonder if Kenny Washington, Charles Folis are proud of what they've done. I'm sure they are, but there's still some work to be done. I would think that they'd say there's still some work to be done. There's still some doors to be knocked down. You know, we have great athletes in the sport right now, but they continue to face second-rate treatment from the NFL, if I might say. I don't know. That's my opinion, but I still think the NFL has a long way to go in recognizing who carries the sport, what has been done by African Americans in the face of so much pressure. It seems like the Colin Kaepernick incident was a long time ago, but it wasn't. And they're still faced with the same problems. You know, recently, Colin Kaepernick, who Netflix is doing a documentary on, they had to shut down the filming because the Proud Boys threatened to protest. So I still say the NFL has a long way to go. They've apologized to Colin Kaepernick, but I think that was out of all the protests that were going on. They were kind of forced to do that. I still think the NFL has a long way to go. I have a couple of last, but not least, people that I want to mention who are great in their own right. The first NBA player that was African American was Earl Lloyd. He stepped on the floor October 31st, 1950 for the Washington Capitals. Chuck Cooper played for the Boston Celtics in 1950, and Nate Sweetwater Clifton played for the New York Knicks in 1950. They were the first. I also want to say a little something about the NHL. The first African American to step on the ice was Willie O'Ree, Eldon O'Ree, I believe. He stepped on the ice January 18th, 1958 for the Boston Bruins, who were then the Bruins, and he played for the Canadians as well. No other player stepped on the ice until 1974, which was Mike Mawson. So there was a large gap in between there. So I just really want to highlight some of the first that did the work in these respective sports, and I'll try to come up with a little bit more.
I got a couple of quick things to run in. As Chris was running down the names of these folks, it just spurs, thoughts and memories of me. Just, you think about Jack Johnson. One of the things, the first time I ever heard of Jack Johnson was that movie, The Great White Hope, with
me too.
James Earl Jones playing.
Yeah.
So that gives you, I don't know. It was very, accurate as close as possible. Of course, Hollywood, took it over a little bit, but it gives you a little insight on what he had to deal with, coming up, as a black heavyweight champion at that time. Of course, Jackie Robinson, the movie out, 42. Charles Sifford even has his own movie. It's called Uneven Fairway. He's from down here in Charlotte, and I played on his golf course, so he gets recognized down here. I don't know, nationally, he should definitely be getting a lot more recognition. But one of the things I said about Althea Gibson, she was an absolute, phenomenal tennis player. But I found out a couple of years ago she was the first black on the LPGA tour. So
Really, I didn't know
she
that.
played golf too,
and an amazing golfer.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I know that about her.
That just blew me away.
Yeah.
But just jot things down from what I remember. And I mean, this was so on the money, Chris, because all of them, deserve recognition and were absolute trailblazers in
Absolutely.
sports. Not just for blacks, but period. Arthur Ashe.
Exactly. Took the games to new heights.
Definitely. So awesome.
You know what struck me about Jack Johnson was the amount of real estate that he owned. I mean, he wasn't just an athlete. He knew, he had a plan, and he was amazing. And they stripped him of everything, man. Stripped him of all his wealth, and really tried to tear him down. And he just faced them down. He wouldn't back down. I mean, he was amazing, just amazing. I also want to add in, I forgot one more person, Wendell Scott. He was the first African-American to win in NASCAR, in 1953. So, he's in he's the first African-American inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, which was in 2015. And yes, so we had a lot of firsts in a lot of areas and a lot of sports that people would, football and basketball, and baseball, people would assume that we would be in there. But for us to dominate in tennis, in golf, in NASCAR, in hockey, in places where we weren't supposed to be is even more telling.
And the first I ever heard of Wendell Scott was Richard Pryor played him in Grease Lightning.
Grease Lightning. Yep. But, I think that's where most people will know him from. Yeah. And that was a great movie. Richard Pryor was excellent.
He stepped back from just being a comic and being a comedian and took that role seriously.
Absolutely. And on the heels of losing Hank Aaron, we need to keep these people alive.
Most definitely.
They meant so much more to us, and we can't allow time to separate us from these people. Again, I grew up watching Channel 13. They used to have Eyes on the Prize on all the time. And they would show these people. They're not showing them anymore. The great thing now is so many young African Americans are taking it upon themselves to make movies about these people. And we need to go out and support these ventures, these movies, these shows. We need to let our children know where they come from, the legacy that's out there. I'm sure there's so many young girls out there, and no doubt they should love Serena Williams, but they should know Wilma Rudolph. They should know Zena Garrison. They should know some of these people. A lot of people probably don't know Zena Garrison. I say Zena Garrison was Serena Williams 20 years before she got there.
Yeah, I never heard of Zena Garrison.
Yeah.
Zena Garrison was phenomenal.
She was.
But the sport wasn't ready for her, you know? And she still did her thing. She was out there, you know, even Yannick Noah back in the 80s, supreme tennis player out of France. You know, his son is an NBA player. Right now, he played for the Knicks and the Chicago Bulls. But Yannick Noah was phenomenal. So many people don't know. You know, so many people get lost in the mix, and they don't know about these folks. You know, we got to remember a Gabby Douglas in 2012. You think 2012 was so long ago, and look how many years it took for an African American to win an all-around championship in the Olympics in her line of the sport. It's just amazing what we had to do and how much we had to fight through to get to these places. There's so many people out there. You know, you got Jesse Owens, who is a monster in his sport, from Jesse Owens to Carl Lewis. You know, these people bridged the gap. And they did it when they weren't supposed to. You know, Jesse Owens would say he experienced more racism in the States than he did going up against Hitler in Germany.
Yep.
Is that amazing?
Yep.
It's incredible. Hitler shook his hand and he came back to this country and our president didn't even invite him to the White House. I mean, it's incredible that these people had the will to keep pushing through in a place that didn't love them. And they represented the country. He represented the country well. Fantastic. He put the country on his back at a time when the world was in peril. And you know what? Hitler thought he was going to have a party that day. And Jesse Owens wrecked it. Come home, nothing. It's amazing. These stories, just the little things that are never told. And we got to ring the bell and we got to keep these people out there. We got to keep them alive. You know, I'm rooting for Serena today. Even though the young girl is tough.
That's right.
I want her to make history. You know, I want Serena to go down as the greatest tennis player ever. Because she is, in my opinion.
She is.
She is in my, but that will put a stamp on it. Another title. She got a tough match today because Osaka is pretty good. But that's my wrap on sports right now. I appreciate you guys. These are just some of the people that really touch me in a way that I'll never forget. You know, again, I love football. I love football. I love basketball. To me, the most interesting person that I mentioned again was Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was just an incredible person.
Yeah, he was a bad man, no doubt.
Yeah, he was feared, but he was smart. He was smart. You know, this guy had a lot of things going, man. You know, back then, endorsements, who would think that they would use an African American to endorse something? A Negro. But that's how popular Jack Johnson was. White people loved him. Well, this is Christopher Sweeney. I appreciate the Walt Weekly for allowing me to share some of my sports heroes during this first salute to African Americans and Black history with the Walt Weekly. It really is amazing. I'm a sports fanatic. I love the intricate things. I love digging for things that people don't know about. And I love celebrating us. And these athletes did it at the toughest time. And they should be celebrated and never forgotten.
Thank you, Chris. You're a tremendous asset to the team. And, we appreciate you. I mean, we really appreciate you guys, what you've done and what you do. remorse, hey, you the man.
I guess I'm gonna take over. Michelle was gonna jump in.
Yes,
But
take over, Greg.
I'm gonna take her spot. And this is Greg Coleman, and I will be highlighting blacks in the military. We go back to the very first conflict when the bullets started flying in the American Revolution. The black person was the first person to shed blood for this country. Crispus Attucks in 1770 was part of a insurrection against British troops, and he was the first person shot and killed. And Boston and patriots from Boston rallied around him, and that pretty much kicked off the American Revolution. After it got started, you had other prominent blacks, one such as Peter Salem, who was known in Boston as the sharpshooter for the American Revolutionary Forces, and he was used strategically against British troops. A side note, at the same time, there were, even though it wasn't for the American forces, there were quite a few blacks in this country fighting for the British because they were the first ones to offer freedom to whoever joined the military. So, enslaved blacks, it was a no-brainer for them to join, the British troops as opposed to the American Revolutionary Forces. But there were a good amount of blacks fighting for, along with the Patriots. And it got to the point in 1778 where we got our first, what they call colored regiment. And that was the Rhode Island Regiment, Rhode Island Regiment. And they became instrumental in fighting against the British. One in particular, they stood up at the Battle of Yorktown and held their line so the brunt of the American forces can escape what it seemed like they were boxed in by the British, and the First Rhode Island Regiment held them down while the brunt of the forces could escape. So they were immediately instrumental after facing quite a bit of hesitancy, and in particular from George Washington, who maintained until he was pressured to change it. He did not want enslaved blacks to fight in the military. But after a while, with so many of them jumping over to the British forces, he didn't have a choice. And he had to, and we were instrumental in changing the tide. We were losing, handily losing the war because they didn't have the manpower. We didn't have the manpower, but when it switched over and they started letting enslaved blacks fight, then that kind of turned it the other way. This went all the way, spilled over into the War of 1812, where blacks instrumental in that war, in spite of the fact that they still were enslaved and treated as property here. In the War of 1812, they made quite a few black regiments. The 24th, 25th, 38th, 39th, 40th, 41st Infantry divisions were all black regiments. A lot of them were used strategically in that as infantry soldiers specializing in guerrilla warfare, and the British, being so structured, still weren't accustomed to fighting that style of guerrilla warfare, and we put a pretty big dent in what they had to come at us in those wars. So they couldn't really handle blacks fighting in that style. But we were motivated at that time, thinking that this could lead to our freedom. It didn't, but that's some. People might wonder why blacks would fight back then for a country that enslaved us, but it was just the hopes of freedom, and it wasn't even paid. They weren't even getting paid to fight. They kind of dangled that freedom out in front of them, and we fought valiantly in spite of. Later on, around after the Civil War, I'm purposely jumping over the Civil War because that is extremely detailed. Whether they were fighting, whether we were fighting for freedom, we were fighting against each other. But after that conflict, in 1867, that's when the Buffalo Soldiers were established, and that's when things started to move westwardly. And the U.S. Army really didn't have an answer for how to deal with Native Americans, Indians. And blacks were once again called upon to be that ingredient that could, if they couldn't go hand-to-hand combat with Indians, they could at least negotiate better than white men who they absolutely did not trust. So a lot of times, we were the tool used, to combat the Indians. And whatever the case, there was still, we fought valiantly. We stood head and shoulders above. I mean, the Buffalo Soldiers are renowned. They're legendary in how they fought, their integrity, and the valiance in which they showed, throughout the war effort in the expansion to move west. Around that time, someone of significance was Henry O. Flipper. He became the first black soldier to graduate from the U.S. Military Academy. So I don't have to tell you, in the 1860s, what he faced just getting in the U.S. Military Academy. And then once he was in the academy, the efforts to get him out of the academy. So, that to me is a standout, just the fact that he finished and graduated as the first, West Point cadet. I'd say from there you go to close to the turn of the century when we started to become more established as, as legitimate military regiments were been established, and particularly because the war effort took a turn into Cuba, and again, the same thing they faced with the Indians, they faced with the natives of Cuba. Blacks were more effective. Black regiments were extremely effective in combat in Cuba, just because, number one, the climate, the terrain, and there wasn't too much difference between us and the Cubans fighting. So they were extremely effective down there. One thing to note was black regiments saved Teddy Roosevelt's renowned Rough Riders in that effort in Cuba. They were pinned in and they were on their last leg, and the 10th Cavalry came comprised of black soldiers, came along and saved him. Quite a few white soldiers said, quote, if it hadn't been for that black cavalry, the Rough Riders would have been exterminated. How many times did you hear that growing up in school? Never.
None.
Never. I'd never heard about that in school. And I was in the military, and
Right.
I never heard that. So
Me either.
that brings us close to World War I. And again, it was the same pattern for blacks, looking for legitimacy, looking for freedom, looking for recognition as men, as looking for equal footing, looking for equality. We signed up and ran out to defend this country in the First World War and the battle for democracy. That was the first time that phrase was really ever used. We're battling for democracy overseas, and it didn't exist here. But look for what we could possibly get out of it. We went ahead. 350,000 black soldiers served on the American Expeditionary Forces on the Western Front in World War I. We were a part of that conflict, in per capita, larger than most others. And we served valiantly. There were quite a few Medal of Honor winners, specifically in World War II, because of our valiant service. Same thing that happened specifically World War I Medal of Honor recipients. One was John Denny, another Edward L. Baker. There was William H. Tompkins, and all for service and heroics in the face of combat. So we stood next to, to anybody. We can hold our head up in anybody in how we serve in conflict. And the most renowned infantry division in World War II was the famous Harlem Hellfighters. They were the 369 Infantry Division based in Harlem, New York. And they were sent into the worst area during the most, the most difficult fighting period in Europe. And just brought in all kind of honors. And that's how they got that Hellfighters moniker, because just people were amazed at the ferocity in which they fought. And the French government, went out of their way to recognize the heroics of the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. Next, it brings us to World War II, and even more blacks, 900, almost a million African Americans served during World War II. And we heeded the call just like anybody else across any other racial lines. We stood out there and said we were going to serve as Americans for the same cause. To note, of course, the first black commissioned nurse, first black lieutenant in the Army was U.S. Army Air Corps Della Rainey during World War II. Very of note, the 78th Tank Battalion, it was the first black armor unit, and they received all kind of awards and distinctions in battle. Of course, the Tuskegee Airmen, one of the most famous air corps in the military, hands down. Known for their red-tailed P-51 Mustang fighters, they never lost an escorted plane to the enemy during the course of World War II. Just think about that distinction when you look at how many bombers were lost overall. I don't have the exact numbers on that, but the Tuskegee Airmen never lost one.
Wow.
A little-known entity in 1945, the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. They were a postal battalion made up of all black women. There was a problem with mail in the European theater. They sent them over there. Mail had been stymied and blockaded for 2 years. They gave these women the unreasonable task of clearing this up in Birmingham, England, in 6 months. Of course, the women did it in 3. And nobody can do it for them. No other entity could do it during the course of the war. These women went over there and took an impossible. Again, mail was important, extremely important back then. We didn't have email or telephones like we do now, and so mail was essential to the soldiers and to the war effort. So that was, and I've never heard of that either. I've never heard, this.
Neither have I.
So, hats off to them. You had, of course, Medal of Honor winners during World War II. First Lieutenant Vernon Baker, First Lieutenant John Fox were given Medal of Honor distinction for heroism during, armed conflict. From there, we went into the Korean War. Once again, black infantry distinguished themselves because at that point, even during the Korean War between 1950 and 1953, we were still separated, if you can believe that or not. And that's not, I was born in 1963, so this is only, 10 years before I was born that, we were still separated. But we still fought valiantly with distinction. 3,000 deaths of active duty black service members during the Korean War. Black soldiers served in all combat elements and were, instrumental in United Nations forces that protected that assaulted the Chinese border. again in distinction. Then next, you have the Vietnam War. 7,243 Black service members died in the Vietnam War.
The Census
again,
War.
you know, of course, you know, shrouded with different politics and unpopularity. We were side by side. Now, you know, Korean War, the Vietnam War, we weren't totally separated, but we were still not considered, you know, first-class soldiers, you know, by certain entities in the War Department. So we still had to stand in there, especially in light of what was going on in civil rights eras in the United States. We still, a lot of times we got dragged into this war. This was a little different because of its unpopularity, but we still fought just as valorous as anyone. You go from there to the Persian Gulf. I mean, now, you know, it's one entity. Blacks jumped to the defense of the nation during the 90 to 91 during the Persian Gulf War, just like anybody else, and fought with distinction. The same thing, you know, in 2001 to present. We're integral in every armed conflict, especially, you know, considering, you know, after 9/11, it's considered, you know, the war on terror. But we were instrumental, just like, you know, anybody else, throughout our history. 500,000 during the Persian Gulf War, 500,000 of the U.S. military personnel in the Mideast were African Americans. That's 24% of the armed services at that time. So one of the things, the points that I, you know, like to drive in here is, you know, when we talk about this is our country and we, you know, we're here, we defend, honor, we're Americans, we're patriots. No one stands above us when it comes to patriotism. No one stands above to their commitment to believing that we belong here and we're just as much vested in what happens in this country as anybody. So we don't take a backseat to anybody in our military service, our patriotism, and our valor and honor and distinction in defense of this country. That's pretty much it.
I'll piggyback you on that. There, you'll find nobody more patriotic than an African American soldier.
That's right.
That's true. That's true.
That's right.
And I would like to add one thing real quick here. I would like to dedicate the military portion of the show to a friend, a colleague, a mentor, a family friend, to Captain Cassius Alonso Harris, Lieutenant. He was a captain, and he was one of the first. And he flew for the Tuskegee Airmen, so he was one of the first Black pilots of the Tuskegee Airmen. And I just wanted to take this opportunity, since we're talking about the military, to tell you about this guy a little bit, because he was very close. He was like a father figure to me. And I give you a joke. You know, we went down some years back when I was in the gold business. He was a diamond dealer and a rice guy. But anyway, we went down to Philadelphia to meet with a potential investor. And this investor happened to be a Black man. I don't like calling out, but this, it all plays in. But we met with this Black guy and we did our presentation and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of the meeting, the Black guy said to us, "Okay, I'll get back to you guys in the fourth night." And me and Mr. Harris, look, I could never call him Cash. He always wanted me to call him Cash, you know, short for Cassius. I could never call him that. I always call him Mr. Harris. I said, "Mr. Harris, what do you mean?" We looked at each other. And when we got on the train from Philly to go back to New York, that's all we laughed about. What the hell is a fourth night? What the hell is a fourth night? We could wait, but actually the British use the fourth night, and what it really is. Can anybody tell me what a fourth night is?
I believe is a fourth night 2 weeks.
That's right, 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Yeah,
2 weeks. I never heard of it. So anyway, I do want to dedicate the military portion of this to Captain Cassius Alonso Harris III. And he died in 2008, but he was a Tuskegee Airman. He was a pilot, one of the first 200. And I think it's only appropriate for us to mention him during this segment.
Honors,
Salute.
definitely.
Absolutely.
We salute. And thank you.
Can I piggyback two things before you go on, Greg?
No, I'm done. Yeah,
the George Washington portion struck a nerve with me because he was adamant about not using African Americans because he was afraid that they would lose the commodity in the slaves, that they would get. His only concern was the slaves as a commodity. That was it. He didn't even care about, shooting themselves in the foot. Didn't care about winning the war. He cared more about losing the slaves. Yeah.
And one of the things that was multifaceted with him, because not only was, did he just see the slaves as a commodity, but remember, he was a Virginian. And he was also worried about his constituency turning against him in Virginia by doing it, because they were so dependent on the slave trade, as a labor force, that if once he set a directive that they could join the war, and get their freedom, they'd lose them all. They'd lose their complete workforce, and he bowed down to them. Everybody. He did not want to back, but he had no choice after a while. But you're right. We sit here and talk about the father of our country all day, but recognize who he really was.
People need to really see him for what he was. And I also want to say something about when we fought in Europe. So many of the people who risked their lives to fight didn't even come back because they were treated better in Europe. They stayed over there.
Chris,
and it's amazing.
It's amazing how when I read it, when I read about it, they got that in Germany, they got that in France, they got that in Italy. So many countries across Europe, they were treated better than they were treated here and stayed.
Yep, and stayed. So many of them came home decorated and were beaten out of their uniforms.
That's the truth.
When they returned home, it's amazing. They never got the benefit of government subsidies to help them get on their feet, to get homes like the white military men and women did. They never benefited from any of that.
Great point.
The country owes them they owe them so much more than they, just acknowledging them and, posthumously giving them these medals. They should give their families money because they kept these people from, living fruitful lives when they came home after giving up so much for this country. It's a shame. It's criminal what they've done to the black soldier.
And it was cyclical. Every conflict, we dealt with the same dynamic. Every conflict.
Okay, so Michelle Sweeney Mccombs, my contribution to Black History Month, I will discuss inventors and entrepreneurs. So there's so many in this history that is not even documented, but I just picked a few that were my favorites. So I'm going to start with Jehu Jones Sr. He was born in 1769 and he passed away in 1883. Jones was a free Black entrepreneur in Charleston, South Carolina. He was known for owning the Jones Hotel, a famous hotel in Charleston, South Carolina. He was born a slave to a tailor. He grew up learning his master's trade. He saved enough money and he bought his freedom in 1798 for $140. So he was able, after he bought his freedom, he was able to open up his own tailoring shop from the trade he learned from his master. He ran into a lot of problems dealing with white people being able to collect his money because they didn't think he was worthy of being paid because, he was a Black man during that time. And slaves didn't have freedom. A lot of them didn't, and he was able to buy his freedom. So under the South Carolina law, he was able to file a lawsuit against them, and he won. So he took that money, and became very successful with his business. And he was also able, with his son, Jr. to expand on the business. So with his business expanding, getting more wealthier, he was able to invest in real estate in Charleston, and his investments grew, and his value, financially he grew, and he was able to purchase slaves out of slavery in 1807. So he's helping his people along the way as he was making himself rich in his entrepreneurship. So in 1809, he purchased a house and a plot of land, which was rare back then. And the property, he bought it for $13,000, and he sold it to St. Michael's Church in Charleston, South Carolina. So he became, with one of the properties, he used it, his skills. He got out of the tailoring business, and he passed the business on to his son and his wife, and he started innkeeping. He was able to be profitable with the properties. The hotel became famous for white people that visited because he had good hospitality, and he had good food, and it was a real famous hotel in Charleston, South Carolina. So that was an easy thing for him during that time, and free sleep, and also helping other people get their freedom as well. So now I'm going to skip a little ahead because I have a favorite, a young lady named Sarah Rector. Her grandfather was a slave. They were Indian in Taft, Oklahoma. She was known as the richest black girl in the world at the time. She was known as the richest black girl in the world. She was a millionaire in her race. Her grandfather was actually a descendant of the Muskogee. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. So it's Muscogee, Creek Nation. It was a Creek Indians before the Civil War, which became part of the Muskogee Creek Nation after the Treaty of 1866. So as descendants, they were listed as freedmen. I'm sure everybody heard of freedmen.
Oh, yeah.
On the doors roll. Yeah. So that gave them entitlement. Yeah, that gave them entitlement to land allotments under the Treaty of 1866, which was made by the United States with the 5 civilized tribes. So she in turn was an ancestor. She was entitled to this land. So her father wasn't able to pay taxes. So what he did was with Sarah's portion, he leased it out to an oil company, right? So this oil company leased it out. They're digging in the land, and lo and behold, oil is on that land. So she started receiving, residual income because they were making, money off of this land from the oil. So she was getting like $30 annual, like $30 and $300 a month, and then it started to escalate in numbers because they struck it rich with the oil. So being that she was the youngest and she was black, by then they created laws with black wealthy people and children, minors, that unfortunately back then they appointed a white person to be her guardian instead of her parents, to control her money, everything about her, and to control the land. So that in turn, when black people got wind of that, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois contacted NAACP because they were like, why are these white people controlling her money? And with that control, they were able, mind you, this girl's 12 years old, to legally have her marry a white man to take over her wealth.
Yeah,
so stealing. Right, they were stealing it from her, but they got wind of it. The NAACP got control of it. They were able to establish a children's department in the NAACP, which investigated the claims against the white guardians who were suspected of depriving black children of their land and wealth. So they got involved. She was able to go to school, and by that time she was 18 years old. Her riches was even more. So She had a successful life. She was educated. She ended up going to college in Tuskegee, Alabama, got her degree, lived her life and her wealth. She had 3 sons. She was married. She had 3 sons. And she was able to live a lavish life after that. So I just thought that was interesting because she was so young. And the fact that you never hear of Indians receiving any wealth from what happened to them as well. And that was just an interesting story, especially in Oklahoma. And I actually used to live in Oklahoma and see all the Indian reservations where, they weren't even considered part of the community. So that was incredible to me. So my next inventor is a female as well. And she reinvented the ironing board. I didn't know you could reinvent something if you don't own it, right? So, hold on one second. Her name is Sarah Boone. She was born in 1832 and 1892. Of course, she was born enslaved. She was a 19th century African-American dressmaker. She was awarded a patent for her improved ironing board in 1892. She was one of the first Black women in U.S. history to receive a patent, which was awesome. She expanded on the original ironing board, which was a horizontal wooden block that was originally patented in 1858. So in 1892, she improved it with additions. It included features like a narrower and a curved design, and making it easier to iron garments, particularly for women clothing, because women mostly iron their clothes. So her design would be morphed in the modern ironing board that we use as of today. So that's just a short story about her. Another young lady that I would like to focus on, in 1966, Mary Van Britton Brown, she co-invented the home security system. She was from Queens, New York, and before the systems became a fixture in homes, she created this device because she was home a lot by herself. She was a nurse. She spent a lot of nights at home. Her husband was away a lot, and she didn't feel safe. And her and her husband created this device. And as we know now that, how the security systems have expanded, she created that system back in 1966, which is awesome.
Was she able to flourish off of that idea?
She flourished off of it. Yes, she flourished off of it. But once you sell something, I don't think it was ever it wasn't patented because they didn't mention that. She just created that device, and it flourished from there. But I don't think she profited from the other security companies that came in to create it from there. So she created that device in 1966, which is really awesome. So my next one is Annie Malone. In 1877, she was a businesswoman, an inventor, and a humanitarian. She developed a mail order beauty care products. She mentored Madam C.J. Walker. She worked under her. So she's considered one of the first African-American women to become a millionaire. But the only difference between her and Madam C.J. Walker was she wasn't documented as a millionaire. Madam C.J. Walker was. So in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, she founded and developed a large and prominent commercial and educational enterprise centered on cosmetics for African American women. She also owned a school. Madam C.J. Walker, 1867, was born on a cotton plantation. Her parents were freed slaves. She became wealthy after inventing a line of African-American hair care products. Once she suffered hair loss, scalp ailment from depression and unhealthy living. So she created her own products through that scalp disorder. She also opened a beauty school. She created a pomade formula, and she also opened and built Villa Lawaro Mansion, where she hosted yearly conferences for all of her stylists, people that worked in her salons. She educated these young women. She had the first beauty school as well. And like I said before, she was one of the first documented millionaires, entrepreneur. So for my next inventor and entrepreneur would be Garrett Morgan, 1877. In 1923, he invented the 3-light traffic light. I'm sure that's like a main topic that they teach you. If they're going to teach you in school any Black history, he is the main one that they focus on, of course. Yep, he was the son of an enslaved parent with only an elementary school level. He also came up with several inventions and improved the sewing machine, the gas mask, and Morgan's most influential invention was the improved traffic light. It was actually 2 lights, and he improved it to 3 lights, a 3-light system. Yeah, so which is great. I have next is Frederick McKinley Jones. He was born in 1893, and in 1940, he invented refrigerated trucks. So, when you go to your local store, your local grocery store, and you see your produce, those refrigerators came from his invention. So you can credit him for inventing 60 patents throughout his lifetime, including the roof-mounted cooling system that was used to refrigerate goods on trucks during the extended transportation in the mid-30s. He also received a patent for invention in 1940 and co-founded the U.S. Thermo Control Company, later known as Thermo King. The company was very critical during World War II, helping to preserve blood, food, and supplies during the war. So that was a great thing. I didn't know that one until I looked that one up. It was very interesting. Somebody had, to do something around that time. So getting back to Carter G. Woodson, who invented the Black History Month, which was called the Negro History Week. Long, because a lot of people think, Black History Month is too short, which I also thought so too, but I never knew why they picked February for it. And it also goes back to Frederick Douglass' birthday and Abraham Lincoln's birthday. That's why it was created. So, and the book Miseducation of the Negro was written by Carter G. Woodson as well. I just want to tap on Oprah Winfrey was the first Black female billionaire of her time. So there's so many other women that are entrepreneurs, and I actually, my shiro is Madam C.J. Walker, and there's also a movie called Self-Made about her life. Greg mentioned it earlier about Hollywood, how they depict things. Some of it is true, and some of it is not true, because Hollywood wanted to depict certain things in reference to Black people. Everything is not positive in that movie. They did show some negativity in it, which wasn't true in her lifetime. But yeah, she was phenomenal. She had a warehouse, a factory actually in Indianapolis, where she housed not just for her products, she housed businesses. There was law firms in that building. There were barbershops, beauty shops, bakeries, all for Black people. She gave a lot of people a lot of opportunities during that time that she could afford to. She died in 1919. She was also part of the Harlem Renaissance, thanks to her daughter, Layla Bundles. Layla Bundles didn't work much. She just lived off of her mother's riches, but she traveled a lot. She was in Harlem. She bought a brownstone in Harlem. And that's where she entertained, the likes of Langston Hughes, all the jazz musicians and artists came to that home to entertain. And, it got to a point where Layla was spending so much money, they were going broke. So in turn, they had to sell some, Madam C.J. Walker had passed away. She was sick, and I think she had a heart attack, and she died young, but her daughter didn't run the business like her mother did. So They still have the property, which is actually in New York, Villa Lawaro, the mansion, and it's used as a like a museum. So it was definitely preserved, but she put a lot into her community. She was also an activist. She donated a lot of money to NAACP, and she was really good friends with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.